Star Wars Episode 1 The Phantom Menace was released in May of 1999, and it was one of the most anticipated films of all time. People camped out front of movie theaters a month in advance in order to get tickets for opening nights, and then in order to get the best seats for the very first showing of the film. Some businesses even closed down for a couple of days due to so many employees asking off of work. And then the movie was released. The initial reviews were lukewarm, not dreadful, and it certainly had its defenders and made a ton of money at the box office. Came out when I was 17 years old, and I was one of its defenders. I went to go see it countless times in the theater. It might be the movie that I've seen in the theaters the most times. To state the obvious, the movie's reputation with the public pretty quickly soured. There was too much CGI, too much juvenile humor and Jar Jar Binks, some bad acting from a child actor, way too many Senate hearings, too many discussions about trade routes. The prequels were supposed to be about Obi-Wan and Anakin being great friends. They're supposed to be about the Clone Wars. They're supposed to be about a love story. And none of that is really in this movie. In fact, one popular order to watch the Star Wars films, the Machete Order, leaves out Episode 1 entirely because it doesn't progress any of these very important plot lines, and everything you need to know from this movie, you learn about it in Attack of the Clones. And this is incredibly frustrating to me because I think George Lucas actually had a pretty good structure. He had a bunch of good ideas inside of this film, but as is often the case with Lucas, he's kind of his own worst enemy and shot himself in the foot. So this video is my pitch for how to take Lucas's structure and his good ideas and fix the Phantom Menace. Hi, my name is Sean, and I love to talk about movies way too much. With that in mind, go ahead and join me down below in the comments section. Share your take on the Phantom Menace. Do you think it's good as is and it doesn't need to be fixed? Or are you someone that has many problems with it? What do you think are the biggest problems with Episode 1, The Phantom Menace? One disclaimer before we get started, I don't think I'm smarter than George Lucas. He's the genius that came up with Star Wars. He's the one that did the hard work of writing a script and directing a movie. It's much easier to look at a finished product, point out problems, and propose solutions. So as we go into this, one of the things I love about Star Wars is that it just kind of opened my creativity to all sorts of different possibilities, and this is just me being a kid again, letting my mind daydream of what this movie could have been. With that said, let's get started talking about the problems. One of the interesting things about Phantom Menace for me is that while there's an enormous amount of criticism of the film, I think they're mostly things that can be fixed. There's a structure in place that actually works for a story that has conflict, character arcs, but because of the execution of specific points, the movie falls flat in far too many areas. So as we go into this later, I'm going to propose kind of what the movie would look like to me, but before I do that, I need to point out the problems that I'm trying to solve with my pitch for the film. Here are the problems I have with it. First off is that Anakin is too young. As a child, he can't be particularly heroic, even in the stuff he does in the third act. It's by accident. He can't build a friendship with a grown man, really. That would be a little bit weird. And he certainly can't have a romance with a girl that's twice his age. And so Anakin needed to be the same age that Luke was in A New Hope to progress his character properly. Second, Obi-Wan doesn't spend enough time with Anakin, so we can't see their friendship forming. When they get to Tatooine, Qui-Gon goes into the city with Padme. Obi-Wan stays back on the ship, and so there's this 45 minute chunk of the movie where we could be building that friendship between these characters, but instead they're in two separate locations. Third one, the humor gets really juvenile. Hey, there have always been some kiddie jokes in Star Wars, but here people are stepping in poop and there's fart jokes. Feels out of place. Fourth one, the Gungans in general, I just don't think fit. They went too silly with them, so they feel outside of what feels right for Star Wars, and I think they're a distraction inside of the story that doesn't need to be there. They take away from plot points that could have been developed because we're spending so much time underwater, traveling through the planet's core, and having a battle with them in droids. Fifth, there's like a 20 or 30 minute section of this film that is all Senate hearings and politics. No action is breaking it up, not much humor. We're just sitting there while they debate what to do with Naboo, and the movie slows to a crawl. Next one on here is that there's too much reliance on CGI and it wasn't quite good enough. The Gungans are an example of that, with just kind of these all CGI characters before we could do that. So I think they should have done more practical effects with this film, like they did, of course, with the original trilogy, because they had to. Seventh, I don't think they should have killed off Darth Maul. They set up a very cool villain, a nice rivalry, and then they killed him off. Obviously, the Clone Wars decided that was a bad idea and they brought him back, but the way it stands in this film, we're supposed to believe that he died, and that was just a really bad decision. And finally, George Lucas should not have directed and written the final draft of the film. George Lucas is a great idea person. He's very good at coming up with interesting characters, these big hero's journey type stories and character arcs, but when it comes down to writing dialogue, writing the specific moments, he needs someone to kind of contain him a little bit and sort through his ideas. And he's also kind of infamous for not really being an actor's director and doesn't get great performances out of people. Absolutely have him come up with the story, have him write the first one or two drafts, then have him pass it along to someone else to make that final couple of drafts that are actually what are shot, and have someone else direct the film. That's essentially what he did with The Empire Strikes Back. So who would I pick to write and direct The Phantom Menace? We'll kick things off talking about writers. First name I'll throw out there, new name for Star Wars, that's David Cope. In the early 90s, he wrote Jurassic Park. In the mid 90s, he did the first Mission Impossible film. And then in the year 2002, he was the writer on Spider-Man. So he's someone that very clearly knows how to do big blockbusters that appeal to a big audience and work with pre-existing properties. That's kind of something he was very good at. And this was kind of his period of time where he was at his peak. The other name that I'll throw out there is the obvious pick for a Star Wars movie, Lawrence Kasdan, the writer of Empire Strikes Back, the writer of Return of the Jedi. He's very good at this, so he's an obvious pick to take George Lucas's ideas and turn into a great Star Wars movie. As for the director, to throw a few names out there, the obvious one that never would have happened, would have been a ton of fun, would have been Steven Spielberg. He's my favorite director of all time. When he teamed up with Lucas on those first three Indiana Jones films, that turned out pretty good. And the idea of him playing around in the world of Star Wars is, of course, a dream come true for me. I don't know that that one was ever on the table. So to move on to some other names, another name I thought there was Joe Johnston. He's someone whose history was with Lucasfilm working on the original Star Wars trilogy. He then became a director. He did The Rocketeer. He did Jumanji, Jurassic Park 3, Captain America, The First Avenger. So he's done big blockbusters. He's done stuff kind of with this sort of adventure kind of vibe to it. And he comes from the world of Star Wars in his background. But the name would probably be my number one pick in the year 1999 would have been Ron Howard. This is also someone that has a history with Lucasfilm, with George Lucas. He actually acted in American Graffiti. He's the one that directed Willow, which was based off of a George Lucas story, and then he kind of brought it to the big screen. And the 90s was when Ron Howard was absolutely in his prime. Now, the immediate pushback that some of you will give me is that we did get a Star Wars movie from Lawrence Kasdan and Ron Howard. It's called Solo. It came out a couple years ago, and it's not the finest of Star Wars films. I don't really think that that's a fair comparison at all, for the obvious reasons that the Disney era has had a large number of problems. Lawrence Kasdan was brought in to write like a spin-off movie about a character that he wrote years earlier. Ron Howard was brought in after the movie was 80% finished. This is not the same thing as kind of taking the story of a visionary like George Lucas, giving it to a great writer and giving it to a great director and allowing them to create a great film. Solo was a Disney product intended to sell toys. I just don't think that's the same thing. If you had this trio of people in the late 90s trying to make a great film, I think we could have gotten something really special. So what is my pitch for Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace? As I go into this, I'm going to try and stick as close to George Lucas's structure as is possible, so it generally follows what happened in the film with some very obvious and very large changes along the way. As I go into it, I'm going to break it down into a 5-act structure, and when there's some recasts, I think there's only one in here for Anakin. I'll discuss that when the character shows up in the story. And let's get started with Act 1, Diplomacy on Naboo. The movie will open essentially the same way with essentially the exact same crawl. Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon are going in to help with the negotiations. Instead of, however, going to a space station, they go directly to Naboo. While there, the same types of things take place where they're put in a room where there's this delay, and then through some series of events, they attempt to take out the Jedi. The Jedis realize something is wrong. They have to go into action, escape, and go into rescue mode. But what I'm trying to do here is essentially remove the entire Gungan plot line out of the film, because the way the movie opens up, they realize there's a problem while they're on the space station, and then they go down with the invading army. They meet Jar Jar. Jar Jar takes them under the water so we can meet the Gungans and realize that he's an outcast, and then we go on a fishing trip through the planet's core so that we can end up in the city of Naboo to try and rescue the Queen. That's a big, gigantic side quest that doesn't need to be there, and it's time from the movie that doesn't develop anything that matters. So our two Jedi go directly to Naboo and realize there's an invasion, and then they go into rescue mode that leads us to Act 2, Escape from Naboo. Since we're not going on our side quest to the Gungans, basically, straight from when they escape from the droids trying to kill them, they go on this rescue mission to try and get the Queen, and that picks up essentially where that happens in the film we see itself. But this will be a more elaborate version of escaping from Naboo, where our Jedi and the Royal Guard have to work to battle through this array of droids and everything to get to the hangar bay in order to get off of the planet. Once they're in the hangar bay, a mysterious figure will show up that Qui-Gon immediately recognizes as a Force user, and he sees Darth Maul in this moment and realizes there's a serious threat here, and this is more menacing than anything that they imagined at that point in time. But there isn't an actual encounter. They just see Maul, and he realizes that there is an evil Sith Force involved in this conflict. They get onto their ships to escape. The Royal Guard are in some fighters, and this, as they're getting off Naboo, this will be kind of the big space battle of the film right here, as the Royal Guard blasts through these droid armies, and then Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan, and the Queen escape from the planet to try and get away from being held hostage by the Trade Federation. Once they kind of break through the blockade, they realize they're being tracked, and Qui-Gon comes up with the idea that they need to break up to keep the Queen safe, but at the same time try to get to Coruscant to tell the Senate and the Jedi about what's going on. So here's one of the big changes in my version of it. Qui-Gon goes on an adventure to Coruscant and to lead people away from him on his own little adventure. And Obi-Wan is assigned to protect the Queen and take her somewhere obscure to put her in hiding. So they head on off to Tatooine, while Qui-Gon leads all the droids astray towards Coruscant so that the negotiations and Senate hearings can take place over a larger period of time. So as this act is about to close out, Qui-Gon heads this way, Obi-Wan heads off that way, and the last thing we see in this act is Darth Maul sees a second ship go off in the other direction, and he starts to track them down towards Tatooine, leading us into Act 3. Hiding on Tatooine. Because of the space battle, the ship that Obi-Wan and the Queen are on has been damaged. So when they start pulling into Tatooine, they realize they're not going to be able to have a nice, safe landing. Obi-Wan at the last minute has the Queen use an escape pod to jettison out of the ship, and then the main craft crash lands on the ground, where Jawas immediately swarm in to try and grab all of the working parts off the damaged ship. Down the road, where Padme crash lands on the planet, she gets out and sand people begin to come after her to kidnap her. Obi-Wan immediately senses that she's in danger and starts to rush towards her. As the sand people close in, a young man jumps in front of her, battles off all of the sand people right as Obi-Wan arrives to see this talented young man who's able to fend off a whole group of sand people and rescue the Queen. Who is the young man? Of course, it's Anakin Skywalker. He's just about the same age as Padme, perfect to have a romance start inside of this film. Who would I cast as Anakin Skywalker? There's a whole bunch of today's leading men who are right in that 16 to 22-year-old age range at the point in time they would have been making this film. I think I'd go with Heath Ledger. He can do charming, he can do the physicality, he's of course a great actor, and we know that he can play an incredibly menacing villain, and that's what you want out of the person that's going to have this turn from being hero friend unto Darth Vader. I think Heath Ledger could be a very interesting choice to do all of that. So immediately, Padme is infatuated with this hero that came in to rescue her, part of it because he's treating her like a normal person. He doesn't know that she's a queen, and therefore he's just respects this person, and she appreciates that she's having a real relationship with someone. And as for Anakin, he's a slave on this planet and she's treating him with dignity. So immediately they have this connection to one another and the romance starts. Also, Obi-Wan sees this person step in and he senses this is a Force user. This is someone that could be someone that should have been picked up by us, but because he's a slave on this off-world, we didn't notice him before, and he begins wanting to train him while at the same time forming a friendship. While on Tatooine, we can have essentially the same sort of plot line to where they have to find a way to make money, to buy the parts, to fix the ship so that they can take off and get wherever they need to be. Whether that's a pod race or another idea, if you want to go in a little bit more harsher direction, since I'm older, I'll be biased a little bit away from the Star Wars' family traditions. Maybe it's a gladiator type battle or something like that, where they have Anakin, instead of doing a pod race, he's having to fight off all these creatures and droids or something like that. Either way, you can have a same sort of plot line in here where we get to know Anakin and see how talented he is, but because he's the right age, you also have him kind of going on these little mini dates at nighttime with Padme to show her all the sights on the desert or whatever. I mean, I'm kind of joking, but there's a sense to which they're building a relationship there. And then you likewise have him spending time with Obi-Wan, who's training him just a little bit in the role that Qui-Gon had in the film. You now have a more kind of that relationship we need to see built between Obi-Wan and him happening while we're there on Tatooine. An important thing we learn about Anakin during this section of the film is that because he's a slave, he hates slavery in the concept of one group of people dominating another, one group of people dehumanizing another and deciding which of this group of people lives and dies and who is and isn't more important than other people. And this is really important because kind of where I'm going to go with some of this stuff in my later films is Anakin's perception of the concept of the Jedi having a clone army, a group of humans created for the purpose of dying for other people's, being created as cannon fodder. That's going to be one of the big rifts in Anakin's mind as he realizes that these people are not exactly who they think they are. They're not realizing the implications of their actions. Meanwhile, Qui-Gon is trying to get to Coruscant to let the Senate and the Jedi know what is happening. So at the point in time where Tatooine's plotline starts to get a little bit talky as they start trying to track down parts and repair things and go on dates, we'll have a big kind of action chase space sequence where Qui-Gon is finally escaping the last of the droid units, so you can kind of break up the talkiness with some space battle thrown in the mix. Then we go back to Tatooine and kind of have our pod race, those sorts of things happen. Then Qui-Gon eventually does get to Coruscant, and so a bunch of the kind of the negotiations, diplomacy, Senate hearings are broken up. Instead of being this one long chunk, it's these smaller chunks intercut with action sequences over on Tatooine. So once he gets there, he lets the Jedi know about it, and they're immediately concerned because they realize a war might break out, and they are not soldiers. They cannot fight a war, and they start to realize we have a problem that is coming. When the Senate hearings happen, they're split. They can't decide what needs to happen, just like in the film. But instead of it just kind of being this kind of trade of who's the chancellor and all of that, it's a little bit more intensive. Like one group is like, war is about to break out. We have to do something to stop the Trade Federation. The other half is like, we kind of agree with the Trade Federation. No, we don't want you to do what you're talking about. And the tension is a little bit stronger than just a vote. At the end of Act 3, Maul finally shows up on Tatooine to kidnap Padme. She is with Anakin, who puts up a pretty good fight, but he doesn't have a lightsaber. He doesn't have any appropriate weapons to defeat Maul, so he's not able to stop him. Obi-Wan is just too far away to get there in time to kind of aid in the assistance. So we see how powerful Anakin can be battling someone, how brave he can be, and also how arrogant he can be, but he's not enough. Padme gets kidnapped, taken back to the planet. Obi-Wan rushes to communication technology, sends message to Qui-Gon saying the war's about to break out. They have captured her. They are absolutely putting this planet under siege. We need the help of the Jedi and the Senate now. You must act or something terrible is going to happen. This point in time, Obi-Wan turns to Anakin and then he uses his classic line,
"You must learn the ways of the Force if you're to come with me to Alderaan."
One of those little echoes, one of those repetitions that George Lucas likes to have, which leads us to Act 4, Rescue the Princess. Obi-Wan, Anakin, and the remaining Royal Guard load up into their now fixed ship in an attempt to head back to Naboo to run their own rescue mission. On Coruscant, Qui-Gon, played by Liam Neeson, who doesn't like it when people are taken, goes to the Jedi Council to inform them of what has happened. She has been taken, and they must act. The Senate will not vote on it. They will not act. So the Jedi, so worried about what's happening, realizing they cannot stop what's coming, decide to unilaterally act and team up with some of the politicians to make a big, bold choice that has not been approved officially by the Senate. Meanwhile, Obi-Wan, Anakin, and the Royal Guard stealthily sneak into Naboo. We have a sequence somewhat like the rescue in A New Hope, where they have to kind of stealthily make their way through the castle, trying to make it to where the Queen is being held. They rescue her, they get into a shootout as they try and make their way to a ship to escape. They make it to the hangar, but they are caught. They're surrounded by droids. A door opens, Darth Maul walks in. The Trade Federation is absolutely done with all of this, and they plan to just kill all of them. All hope is lost. And that leads us to Act 5, Attack of the Clones. Right when it looks like all hope is lost, the cavalry is called in, much like it happens at the end of the movie Attack of the Clones, but I want the Clone Wars to start much earlier in my version of the prequel trilogy, and I want it to happen right here. So when Qui-Gon got that message, he went to the Jedi, and they decided, instead of them becoming soldiers, they decided to unilaterally commission the clone army. This will have been kind of set up earlier in the film. Some of the discussions happening in those meetings and everything would have been about the clones, to where there was a divide as to whether they should or shouldn't do it. And the Jedi, with certain politicians, just make it happen. They push through without getting it fully approved, which will be important for later on at the end of this film, as well as later on in the rest of this trilogy that I'm proposing. So at this moment in time, instead of the Gungans having a war with the droids, clones show up, battle breaks out, and once again, this is the start of the Clone Wars at this moment in time on Naboo. In the chaos of the battle breaking out, Anakin decides to protect the Queen, and the Queen says she knows how to turn off all the droids and informs him where they need to go, so they kind of go off on their own little mission to try and stop the droids. In the middle of this, Qui-Gon shows up to help his Padawan learner, Obi-Wan, who's on his first big adventure, and they go off to have their duel with Darth Maul that plays out essentially like we saw it in the film before. So now the kind of the three fronts of the battle in my version of it is the ground battle with droids and clones. Then you have our lightsaber duel, essentially just as we saw it in the film before. And then we also have this little mission inside of it where you have Anakin as well as the Queen attempting to shut something down. And so you get Anakin in this version doing heroic things. You get to see him really in on the action. In the film that we got, Anakin is like sitting in a spaceship, hits the wrong button, it launches him into space. It's like, whoops, what did I do? I don't think that that's the best use of the character. I want this to mirror much more what we saw Luke do in A New Hope, where you saw kind of this little boy from Tatooine go off on this adventure, and he is this heroic person. That's what I want to see with Anakin. At some point in time in the battle here, the Queen is going to get knocked out and injured by an actual member of the Trade Federation, not a droid, but a living person. And when Anakin sees this, he's so enraged that he uses the Force to viciously kill the person. No one in the movie sees this, but the audience sees it, and we kind of are cheering on this guy dying because we're gonna hate him. The movie's gonna set him up as this horrible person that's being cruel to the Naboo people. But what we know as the audience is that he's gonna turn into Darth Vader, and we're watching the dark side start to come out of him early on as he uses it against this person. So while we cheer the death of the guy, we also know, oh no, this is the start of where this is leading. Anakin thinking he's doing something positive, but doing it using the dark side. In our lightsaber battle, essentially we get the same kind of loss that happens where Qui-Gon gets killed, Obi-Wan is called into action, and he starts dueling one-on-one with Darth Maul. But in the midst of all of this, our two heroes, or our two male and female heroes, are successful in turning off the droid army. So they turn off. Darth Maul realizes that he can't win, and so while instead of having him get cut in half by a guy that's dangling down who doesn't have the high ground, he just escapes to show up later in future films or do whatever he needs to do. The Trade Federation realizes that their invading army has been defeated, and they pull back from the planet. And while the battle is won, the war has begun. In the epilogue to the film, we learn that the decisions of the Jedi, as well as these politicians, has split the Senate in half. A civil war has broken out where half of the galaxy looks at the Jedi as people trying to dominate them that does not listen to what they're saying. So trust in the Jedi is immediately broken, as well as people are just siding with the Trade Federation. And so there's a little bit more to the conflict than just the people side with this group or this group. It's also the Jedi who were the protectors of the peace are now perceived of very differently by a lot of people because they acted unilaterally. They didn't trust the democracy, the republic. They did their own thing, and that's important for where some of this is going. Trust has been broken, and there's a perception of pride and arrogance, and the Jedi aren't fully living up to their ideals. Around this exact same point in time, the Jedi Council accepts Anakin into their ranks to be trained. Back on Naboo, we have our big celebration on the planet that they're no longer under siege, and our final image of the film is Anakin and Padme kissing on Naboo in the midst of all the celebrating that is taking place. So that's the flow of essentially how my version would work. There's some things that definitely need to be massaged, in particular the timing of events, of everything happening at just the right moments. How do you establish the clone army early on and develop the concept so they can show up at the end and it feels like a proper payoff and not just out of the blue. There's some things like that that need to be tweaked just a little bit and figure out exactly how they show up in kind of this cavalry rescuing moment on the planet. But that's the flow that I think resolves a bunch of some of the biggest issues with the film, to where you actually get Obi-Wan and Anakin spending a lot of time together on adventures with a young, heroic Anakin. We just get to see him as this optimist trying to save the day off, leaving Tatooine for the first time. He gets to be awesome. He gets to be the Anakin we wanted to see, that's rescuing a princess, stopping an army, and bravely jumping into the middle of danger. But we also see those little hints of his issues, his problems. Of course, we get the building of the romance starting in this movie, as opposed to wasting the whole first film like George Lucas did by making Anakin so young. No, we get all of that all in this film, so it doesn't need to be rushed in Attack of the Clones, the second one. And then, of course, we also get the start of the Clone Wars in this film. Instead of using the Gungans to have the final battle, just move the Clone Wars to starting here, so we have 2 full movies of Clone Wars. I think that just does a better job of progressing the story, progressing the relationships, and even hinting at the faults of Anakin early on. Whereas young child Anakin, he didn't have any faults. This Anakin is a lot more heroic. He's a lot more charismatic. And then we see that darkness inside of him. We see the anger and the damage that it can do if left unchecked. I think it makes for a better version of the film. If you want more content like this, check out that video I did right over there where I pitched my idea for a Sam Raimi Spider-Man 4. And if you want more kind of these how to fix videos, let me know down below in the comment section which movies you want me to fix in the future. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies too much.